All right, so this is the chemical basis of life. And again, I'm not sure if you guys have had chemistry yet. So this will be maybe a little bit trickier for some of you as we start this. So if we start with chemistry, we talk about matter, mass, and weight. And it's important to understand these concepts in anatomy and physiology, just because a lot of the physiological processes in your body are using chemical formulas and chemical equations. So if we talk about matter, first of all, matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. And that mass can be a solid, a liquid, or a gas. So it can be the desk you're sitting on right now, the chair. Mass is the amount of matter in an object. So that's usually some sort of weight. And the unit for weight in standard units is the gram or the kilogram. And then weight is the gravitational force acting on an object. So due to gravity, that is what weight is. Elements and atoms. So elements are the simplest form of matter. And examples of these are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, calcium, potassium, sodium, and chloride. And they all are abbreviated with those letters that you see right there. So that's what an element is. If you're familiar with the periodic table of elements, it will list all of those elements in increasing atomic number, and we'll talk about what that means. And an atom is the smallest particle of an element. And an atom contains protons, electrons, and neutrons. So if you look at here of the electron cloud, electrons surround the nucleus of an element. And the nucleus is made up of protons and neutrons. So the nucleus is made up of positively charged protons with a positive charge and neutrally charged neutrons. So the neutrons have no charge, and electrons are the ones with the actual negative charge. Can you just unmute yourself? Can you just let me know if you have had chemistry? I'm just kind of curious.
Yes.
Yeah, I have.
Yes, a long time ago.
A long time ago.
No.
No, okay.
Taking it right now.
All right, so let's keep moving on here. So elements, atoms. This is the planetary model of atomic structure. So this just shows you, it's called the planetary model because the electrons orbit around the nucleus of an atom, much like the planets do of the sun. So again, in the nucleus is made up of protons and neutrons. And the atomic structure of hydrogen has one proton because its atomic number is 1 in the periodic table, and it will have it'll have one electron. So it'll have one proton in the nucleus and one electron in the electron cloud. If we look at the carbon atom, its atomic number is 6. So it'll have 6 protons in the nucleus, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons orbiting it. So this planetary model, we call the atoms planetary because the electrons will orbit around the nucleus, much like the planets do around the sun. The electrons fill different orbitals or shells around the nucleus. So that just means that there can be 8 electrons in the first shell or orbit around the nucleus. And then there'll be another outer shell outside of this 8 electron shell. So this is, again, it's just the planetary model of atomic structure. So really generally put, protons and neutrons are in the nucleus, and electrons are orbiting the nucleus in what we call an electron cloud. The electrons are negative, so that's why there's a little negative by this E. The protons are positively charged, and the neutrons are neutral. They do not have a charge, so that's why there's just we call it the naught or the 0 as the superscript next to the N. Okay, so this explains those subatomic particles, we call them, because they are the particles that make up an atom. So the proton is the positively charged particle located inside the nucleus of an atom. The neutron is neutrally charged, located inside the nucleus, and then the electron has the negative charge, and that's located outside of the nucleus in that orbital cloud that surrounds the nucleus. So again, this shows the same picture, the model of an atom. Here's the electron cloud orbiting the nucleus that they've zoomed in on here, showing the proton. Proton has the positive charge and the neutron has no charge. Then we get to atomic number and atomic mass. And the atomic number just refers to the number of protons in each atom. So if the atomic number is 1, it'll have 1 proton. If the atomic number is 25, it'll have 25 protons. So atomic number equals number of protons. And in the periodic table, and I'm not sure if it'll show us a picture of that, the elements are all arranged in increasing atomic number from right to left and then moving down the rows. And again, the atomic number is just the number of protons, and the mass number is the number of protons and the number of neutrons in each atom. You might be wondering, well, why aren't we adding in the number of electrons? And that's because electrons are proportionally, they weigh so much less than protons and neutrons that their mass is very negligible. So we don't even include it in the mass number. So the mass number, we just look at the number of protons and the number of neutrons. So chemical bonds. So we have these elements made up of atoms, and they are chemically bonded to each other to create different substances. So like table salt is sodium chloride. It's the sodium element and the chloride element bonded together. Well, what does bond mean? A chemical bond occurs when the outermost electrons, we call them the valence shell. That just means the electrons that are furthest away from the nucleus, that are orbiting that atom nucleus, they're transferred or shared between atoms. So when we put sodium chloride together, we get table salt. And sodium and chloride are bound together when their electrons are shared between their electron clouds. And there's different types of chemical bonds, so different ways that their electrons can be shared. We can have an ionic bond, a covalent bond, or a hydrogen bond. So let's talk about an ionic bond first, but we first need to talk about what an ion is. An ion is any sort of charged atom formed because of a donation or a gain of an electron. So since an electron is a negative charge, if an atom gains an electron, it will become negative. And if it loses an electron, if it loses a negative charge, it will become positive. So when that happens, we get an ion. We get a charged atom that's formed, whether it donates an electron and becomes positive, or it gains an electron and it becomes negative. So that's an example of this is sodium with a positive charge. So sodium is the Na symbol, and it's positively charged because that sodium has lost an electron. Ionic bonding will then occur when there's an attraction between two oppositely charged ions. So you've heard the phrase opposites attract. The same thing goes in chemistry. Two oppositely charged ions will attract each other. So sodium by itself will be Na positive, and chloride by itself will be Cl negative. And we can bind them or bond them together through an ionic bond because they have two oppositely charged ions. And when they're bound together, they become neutral, but they'll become sodium chloride, which is table salt. Have I lost you guys yet? You're still there, okay. All right, so here's a look at ionic bonding, and again, showing two oppositely charged ions that are bound together. Let me just check the chat quick. Nope, we're all here, thanks. Okay. And this is an example of when we combine the sodium atom and the chloride atom together. And so here's sodium, and all of these orbits that surround the nucleus are showing its electrons. And the electrons, again, are in different shells or layers around the nucleus. And here's the chloride ion showing the different shells of electrons around it. And it's showing how sodium, again, is Na positive because it's lost an electron, and chloride is Cl negative because it's gained that electron. And when we bind them together, we get sodium chloride, which is table salt. So that's an ionic bond. Then we get to the second type of bonding, covalent bonding, and this occurs when atoms share one or more pairs of electrons. And an example of a covalent bond is the hydrogen molecule. We can get polar covalent bonds or non-polar. Well, just polar covalent bonds form when there's an unequal sharing of electrons. An example of this is water. So H2O is water, and it's combining two hydrogen atoms with one oxygen. And there's an unequal sharing of electrons here, so we get an asymmetrical electrical charge. And hopefully we'll have a picture of what that looks like in the next slide. A nonpolar molecule will have a symmetrical electrical charge. So that just means, so a polar molecule means that one side of the molecule will have a positive charge to it and a negative charge. And a nonpolar molecule will mean everything, the charges are exactly aligned. And let me show you an example of this. So here's covalent bonding. The two hydrogen atoms do not interact because they're too far away apart. And then here's an example. The positively charged nucleus of each hydrogen atom begins to attract the electron of the other. So then we get a covalent bond forming when the electrons are shared between the nuclei because the electrons are equally attracted to the nucleus. So this is just an example of covalent bonding, sharing the electrons. Then hydrogen bonding is the third type of bond that we'll talk about. And polar molecules like water have a positive end and a negative end. And a hydrogen bond will form when the positive end of that polar molecule is weakly attracted to a negative end of another polar molecule. So hydrogen bonds are not very strong. They're weaker bonds than ionic or covalent bonds. And you'll find hydrogen bonds between the base pairs in your DNA molecules, which make them really easy to separate for DNA replication that we'll talk about later. So let's see if we have a picture of this. So here's a look at polar covalent bonds, and it's showing
Can we go back for like 2.5 seconds?
Yeah. Are you there, Tristan?
Just to the hydrogen bonding portion.
Yeah.
I was just trying to get the last little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. I was kind of jumping ahead to the next slide because it was showing you example of the polar and hydrogen. So yeah, no problem. All right, everyone good? Are you good, Tristan?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we talked about polar bonding, meaning one side of the element or the molecule is more positively charged than the other. So this is a look at hydrogen, and we call it asymmetrical because the hydrogen atoms, how they're bonded to oxygen, form kind of this angle. So it's not like, I don't know how, if we were in person, I would draw this on the board right now. But H2O kind of is shaped like a triangle because of the way the charges are. So this is showing polar covalent bonds between the hydrogen and oxygen, just showing how the hydrogens kind of come off of oxygen at an angle to make this triangular shape. If it were linear, one hydrogen atom would be here and the other would be directly across the other oxygen. But a polar covalent bond is just showing that one end will be more positive and one end will be more negative. Yes, Brian, it does kind of look like Mickey Mouse. So these polar covalent bonds are what will then we get to these hydrogen bonds and how they will form, because one end, because it's more positive on this end of H2O, it'll be attractive to the negative end of the other H2O molecule. So again, hydrogen bond will form when the positive end of one polar molecule is weakly attracted to the negative end of another polar molecule, much like H2O. So this is showing hydrogen bonds between the positive end of this water molecule being weakly attracted through the hydrogen bond to the negative end of this water molecule. So these again are showing H2Os. The H's, the H atoms are the blue circles and the oxygen atoms are the red circles. And oxygens are bigger than the hydrogen because they have a higher atomic mass, because they will have more protons and neutrons in their nucleus, and they'll also have more electrons. Hydrogens have an atomic number of 1, so that's why they're the smaller bluish circle. But again, this picture is showing polar molecules, and an example of a polar molecule is water, because there's a positive and negatively charged, end to it. And this is the positively end charged of the water molecule being weakly attracted to the negatively charged end of another water molecule. And you can see that here, the hydrogen atom side is weakly attracted to the oxygen end of this H2O molecule. And we call that weak attraction between a positively and a negatively charged polar side of a polar molecule, we call that a hydrogen bond. And again, like a great test question is to just remember what is the weakest bond out of the 3 we just discussed, and that's a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds are the weakest because they're just attracted by charge. They're not actually sharing electrons. Covalent and ionic bonds are actually sharing electrons, so we're forming new molecules. Hydrogen bonds are just attracted through a basic charge. So I've kind of referenced these, the word molecule and the word compound we'll talk about. But what is a molecule? A molecule is whenever you combine 2 or more atoms together. So an example of this is water, H2O. Oxygen, the oxygen that you breathe is O2. It's 2 oxygens bound together. So a molecule is just 2 or more atoms when they chemically combined. A compound is a chemical combination of 2 or more different types of atoms. So sodium chloride is what we would call a compound when we're combining 2 or more different types of atoms. Chemical reactions occur when there is a formation or a breaking of chemical bonds between either an atom, a molecule, an ion, or a compound. So any of the above. Chemical reactions are occurring all the time around you without you even realizing it. And chemistry is kind of the language of all of those chemical reactions occurring. So we get equations here, and this is a chemical reaction equation, and it explains what the reactants are, which are just the products that you start with. And then it'll always have them added together on the left-hand side of the equation. Then there will be an arrow, which is determining what happens during that chemical equation. And then on the right side of the equation, we'll always have the products, which are the substances that result from the reaction. So a good example of this, a chemical equation that I can think of off the top of my head, I do it for my kids, maybe you guys are doing it too as you're homeschooling. If you combine baking soda and vinegar together, those would be your reactants. Let's say A is baking soda, B is vinegar. Then when you combine them together, what will happen? Does anyone know what happens when you put baking soda and vinegar together?
They foam up.
They foam up. They start to form bubbles. Maybe you did this like when you made a volcano for a science experiment. So in that little arrow portion, those foamy or bubbles would be part of the product that would come out of that. So that's just a simple chemical equation that I can think of off the top of my head. So the reactants would be the baking soda and the vinegar. Exothermic reaction. Thanks, Cade. You must have taken some sort of chemistry. And then the products would be whatever's formed off at the end of it. So this is chemical reaction 101, really basic equation there, but we'll plug in to A and B different compounds or molecules. Types of chemical reactions, we can have a synthesis reaction or a decomposition reaction. A synthesis reaction will build a new molecule, and it'll always require energy to do this. So for example, if we want to put ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, and we want to add on another phosphate group to it, when we add them together, we're creating a new molecule, and we call it ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is just an adenosine molecule with 3 phosphate groups attached to it. So that's a synthesis reaction, building a new molecule. A decomposition reaction is exactly what it sounds like, decomposing. It's a breaking down a molecule. And this will be energy releasing. If we take ATP and we break it apart, and again, ATP is just an abbreviation for adenosine triphosphate. And if we break down that molecule, we'll give off energy when we break it down, and we'll break it down into ADP and a phosphate group at the end. So really simply put, when you're synthesizing something, you're building a new molecule, and when you're breaking something down, we call it a decomposition. So pretty simple so far. These are energy and chemical reactions, again showing the reactant and the product. So here is the reactant, and now we're showing a decomposition reaction. We're breaking it down into two products. Because there's a lot of potential energy involved in this reactant, it will give off energy and its products at the end. Then down here we have a synthesis reaction because we're starting with several reactants, combining them to form a product at the end. It's interesting, they're using ATP as an example here. ATP is like the energy currency in all of your cells. So to do any sort of process in your cells, it requires energy. And energy in the body is ATP. An exchange reaction then is a combination of synthesis and decomposition reactions. So we call it an exchange reaction because we'll be exchanging molecules. Thanks for joining us, Dory. Sorry, I just let you in. It's hard for me to always see when people are coming in. So an exchange reaction, we could start with different types of products such as A, B, and C, D. And the reactants, they might switch around some of the molecules. So an example of this is hydrogen chloride, which is HCl, and sodium hydroxide. And in exchange reaction, we would exchange some of the elements around. So through some sort of chemical reaction, we would add heat. We might, to make a chemical reaction, you add heat to it, you stir it, you could add something else, an enzyme to speed it up. And the products would be sodium chloride and water. So an exchange reaction kind of just switches around some of the players in the products and the reactants in that chemical equation. A reversible reaction occurs when the reaction can run in the opposite direction so that the products could be converted back to the original reactants. So a reversible reaction, from here on, you've only had arrows going in one direction. So meaning this chemical reaction could only occur in one direction. In a reversible reaction, the reactants could revert back and form their original products. So a reversible reaction we describe with two arrows going in both directions because the reaction could occur in both directions. A great example of this is the bicarbonate ion in your blood. So I promise this will all come back to physiology and anatomy and why you guys need to learn this basic chemistry. But to control your pH levels in the blood, carbon dioxide is converted into bicarbonate ion to control pH levels in your blood. Equilibrium is when the rate of product formation equals the rate of reactant formation. So equilibrium just means that any sort of reversible reaction will go forward and backward at the same rate. So one side won't be favored more than the other. It'll always exist in an equilibrium state between products and reactants. This is kind of heavy stuff. Is everyone with me so far? Or are we going too fast? Maybe you're all sleeping there on the other end. Okay. So, any questions from you guys so far? It's just a tad slow, you're trying to type. Okay. So keep in mind, yeah, these are being recorded. If this is not the first time you've seen any chemistry, I would encourage you to read even if you've had this before, to read the textbook chapter as well. All right, let's go ahead Let me check the chat one more time here. Okay, no problem, Larry, yeah. All right, let's go ahead. I'm just gonna start talking a little more about energy, and then I'm just gonna probably break early just because I want to give you guys time to read this chapter up until this point. So let's get through a couple more slides that talk about what energy is, and then we'll continue this chapter on Thursday. So when we talk about energy, what are we talking about? Energy is the capacity to do work. And work is whenever we want to move matter, which again, matter is anything that takes up space, and matter is made of mass. So energy is just basically moving stuff. Kinetic energy is energy in motion. So kinetic energy, simply put, is when all the atoms are bouncing off of each other, because everything is made of atoms. The table you're sitting at, the desk you're sitting in, they're all made of atoms. And kinetic energy is the movement of those atoms bouncing off of each other, energy in motion. Potential energy is stored energy. So if you guys have a water bottle on your desk like I do, anything that is above ground level has potential energy in it, because when it falls, it will give off energy. So let's take a look at chemical energy, because this has to do with some of the equations that we talked about. Chemical energy is the form of potential energy stored in chemical bonds. So chemical energy will be formed as potential energy in chemical bonds. What this means is when two elements are bonded together, when we break them apart, they'll give off energy that's in those chemical bonds. Food molecules such as glucose contain a lot of potential energy. So whenever you guys eat something, your body will break it down into glucose, and glucose will go on and be converted to energy in your bodies as ATP. And an example of a reaction that releases energy is breaking down ATP into ADP and a phosphate group. So anytime we break bonds, so adenosine triphosphate are just atoms bonded together. When we break it down into two different smaller products, we'll release energy. So chemical energy is stored in bonds, and bonds just keep atoms and elements together. If we separate out those elements from each other, we'll release energy, and we call that chemical energy when we're separating out elements, because that energy is stored in the bonds that was holding them together previously. This, I promise this will come back when we talk about a little more about physiology. I'm going to just stop right here because I think this was enough to take in for today. And I'm sorry I went through that maybe a little quicker. That's one of many downfalls as a professor. I do happen to talk fast, and I think the online environment doesn't help. So moving forward, if you guys just raise your hand or type in the notes if I am talking too fast, let me know. But I'm going to stop the recording here, and then I'll answer any questions.